Today's episode is brought to you by JEO Consulting Group. JEO Consulting Group is a full-service firm offering engineering, architecture, surveying, and planning to clients throughout the Midwest. Since JEO's beginnings in 1937, we have grown to more than 12 offices across Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas. With over 250 employees, we provide innovative and cost-effective solutions for both public and private sector. The JEO team of professional engineers, architects, surveyors, planners, and financial experts all work in concert with skilled technicians and support professionals to exceed our clients' expectations. Today's episode was recorded in front of a live audience at the APA Nebraska Spring Workshop, Recast Your City. The audience questions at the end were re-recorded for sound quality. Our guest and keynote speaker was Ilana Preuss, founder and chief executive officer of Recast City. Preuss's passion for great places grew out of her experience working with big and small cities all over the United States when she led the Technical Assistance Program at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Smart Growth Program and as the vice president and chief of staff at Smart Growth America. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Urban and Regional Studies from Cornell University and a Master's of City Planning degree from the University of Maryland. Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Can you just start off by telling us why you decided to write the book and who your intended audience was?
The reason I wrote the book is because over my years of working in the planning field, working with communities of all different shapes and sizes across the country, I realized that there were a number of reasons why we weren't getting where we needed to get to. That it wasn't just about policy changes, but it was about who we were talking to, how we were engaging them, and what details we were focusing on. And when I created my company, Recast City, I started very specifically working on how are we bringing downtowns back to life, but through this lens of small-scale manufacturing businesses, which is any business that makes a tangible product that you can replicate or package. And the book came about because, well, there's only one of me and there's a whole lot of cities. And I wanted to make sure that anybody who wanted to take this on had access to the tools very readily. And so that was how the book came about.
And you kind of touched on this about what small-scale manufacturing is, because when I read the title, I was initially thinking kind of industrial uses, but that's not what small-scale manufacturing is. So can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So small-scale manufacturing is any business that makes tangible good. My two phrases that I throw around probably too much is hot sauce, handbags, or hardware, or artisans to advanced manufacturing. So it's anybody who's making a thing that you can replicate or package. And so that's thinking about the food products that are made in our communities or in the agricultural areas around our communities. That's the artisans that might be the vendor entrepreneurs at our holiday markets. That's also our machine shops or our breweries or distilleries or anybody working in advanced manufacturing. But it's generally going to be businesses between 1 and 50 employees in a bigger city like in Omaha or 1 to 20 employees in a smaller town. Because part of the point of it, from my perspective, is how are these businesses fitting into the fabric of our neighborhood? It's not just having them, it's where are we putting them? And as planners, I know you guys think about where we put things an awful lot. But one of the things that's important to me is to think about how these businesses add to our downtowns or add to neighborhood main streets, because most small product businesses need anywhere between 500 to 2,000 square feet, which means that they fit really well into our storefronts. And they can be a phenomenal draw. They can be a phenomenal attraction to our downtowns that might be struggling with what we consider traditional retail stores.
To build off of that, I mean, as planners, we're trying to make these very active, thriving business districts and places that people want to be and move around a lot. And small-scale manufacturing can contribute to that. How exactly do these types of businesses achieve that?
So small-scale manufacturing, to me, they're a little bit magic. And I don't mean to be silly when I say that, but they do a lot of different things that I've always been looking for when I think about how do we make great places. Because my baseline professionally has always been about how are we making great places for the people who live there now. That's sort of been the common thread through my 25 years in the field. And small-scale manufacturing businesses, when we put them in our storefronts, do a number of different things. They attract foot traffic because if we have like a consumer product business, right, that's selling direct to people, they can be in a storefront. The front of it can be retail. The back of it can be where they're doing production, but you can walk in and see something being made. And that's a draw. One of the other wonderful things about this business type is that they can sell in person and online. So they're not just dependent on the foot traffic. They're not just dependent on the expendable incomes within that community. They're quite literally bringing revenue into that community because they're selling online regionally, nationally, and maybe even internationally. And so these businesses are really able to make a difference in how we create places. And on top of that, we have this wonderful heritage and history of making things in pretty much every part of our country and in every different population. You can look across race, ethnicity, income, urban, rural, age, whatever divide you want to look across within our communities. People know how to make things. It's part of who we are. And so when we can reach those individuals, we have the ability to create a much more resilient local economy and a much more inclusive local economy.
You had an example of a leather making business in your book, and I thought that was so fascinating about it. It's not necessarily just they make the product, you come, you look at their goods and leave, but that they had a shop up or a space up front where you could watch them actually making the goods, and it was part of the experience that drew people to the area. So your book was released during COVID. We had a lot of businesses that went under during COVID because of the impact, but that a lot of this was already happening and starting before COVID even came into the mix. So what type of economic development strategies got us to this point?
There's a lot of things that we've kept doing from the 70s from our economic development strategy perspective that we never, I don't know if we never took the step back to say, does this really still make sense? Or we just kept teaching the same thing. I don't know why really, but we ended up with economic development strategies that really only work for a couple of big cities that don't work for most other places. And that's everything from throw a lot of money at some big business that's going to put down their footprint in your community, but probably going to leave 7 years later when they're going to get a better deal somewhere else. That includes things like tech jobs are the only answer that's going to save the day. And that includes things like first come, first serve. I don't even know how to describe that one. Sort of, we're going to announce an opportunity and whoever sees it first is going to get it. And a lot of other pieces. But I think it's important to recognize that the places that do have the most resilient economies, especially when we look outside of the biggest cities, are the ones that went local. They invested in their own community, the physical space, but also the small businesses. And that we need to look at how do we pursue economic development in a way that is for the community and by the community. And that every community has talent and has skills and has people who are entrepreneurial. And the biggest challenge in a lot of cases is how to tap them and then how to connect them to places where we want them to be so that we get that added benefit, like you were talking about. If we walk up to a storefront that has small scale manufacturing going on where you can see something being made in the back, that becomes an amenity, right? That's experiential retail, that's entertainment, that's what's drawing people to a place now. And so how are we thinking, particularly as planners, how are we thinking about policies we're shaping in a way that allows for that kind of flexibility, but really faces the reality of what's going on in local economics? We've also seen this closing of a lot of different chain stores. And this has been going on over the last 5 years where major national chains started to limit their footprint even before the pandemic. So I always throw H&M under the bus. I have nothing against H&M, but some communities that I spoke to that were sort of small to mid-sized cities, the things that their chamber, no offense to chambers, but or their local economic development authority said was, well, we just need an H&M downtown. And the thing that I found myself saying too many times over the last few years is, well, H&M doesn't want to be in your downtown because you have no foot traffic. The reality is these national chains have consolidated to a few or more limited number of prime locations. So there are fewer and fewer places that are going to win that battle for a national chain. And we know that there are local talents and local businesses that can be attractions that are just as good. And so the responsibility that we have and the leadership that we need to take is figuring out how do we invest in our downtowns and in our community, our neighborhood centers in a way that creates a great place already. And then if other folks are attracted to that, phenomenal. That's wonderful. But we really need to think about what are we doing right now with the resources and the people that we have today.
So in the book, you talk about 3 critical mistakes that we often make when we're looking at our downtowns. I'm curious how you narrowed it down to these 3 and what those 3 are.
Now I'm having a quiz on my book. I don't remember. So it's not really a narrowing down, right? There's a million different things we do right and wrong every day in our community. But I think that thinking about, chasing the big businesses, that they're the end all be all answer, when very few places are going to win that competition, and what do the rest of us do? Really thinking about how do we create predictability in real estate so that if a business wants to go downtown, I just talked to a community about this. They had a brewery that wanted to come downtown. It took them, I think, 2 years to change all of the policies that were in place. That was a fairly empty downtown, right? They were desperate for businesses downtown, and this brewery wanted to move in downtown, and they couldn't get out of their own way fast enough. And so any other business like that I spoke to said, well, I don't want to touch that community with a 10-foot pole. And so really thinking about what are we doing from a policy perspective today that is focused on being not only small business friendly from a sort of permitting perspective, but what are all of the different ways that we need to be small business friendly? And what does that really mean from a consumer perspective, right? The client is the small business. What does that look like from their side? But also thinking about who gets access, who gets to benefit from the investments. And it's a question that we really rarely have asked, even though as a planning field, and I talk about this all the time, we've done a lot of harm, right? We've done a lot of things in the past. We were driving around town yesterday and came into one area, and I said, so is this an area that was always empty, or was it urban renewal? Right? We know the impact of what we've done, and we know historically that there are different populations that have been excluded from opportunity, and let alone having investments pulled from different areas. And I believe that we have a responsibility to do better and to do more. And that's also thinking very strategically from the beginning, when we make policy changes, when we make investment changes, who benefits from that work.
Topic of equity, which you touch on pretty heavily in the book, the old economic development model ignored this concept and missed the mark. So how does this new approach address equity?
So the Recast City method is based on the question of how are we reaching the people who we want to benefit from this? So first asking that question, and we'll talk about that. We can talk about this more, but asking this question of what outcome are we trying to seek? Who should benefit? And if we can define who should benefit from it, then we have to define how we find those people. And the biggest challenge that I've heard from planners really over the last 15, 20 years is it's really hard to find the right people, or it's really hard to find our target population. So a lot of what we do is actually introduce a system that makes you go out and meet new people, that makes you go out and talk to new people. And I refer to these people as connectors. So connectors with a capital C. Me and the editors of this book had it out about keeping my connectors as a capital C in the book, because to me it's a title. It's the people who are known and trusted to that target population, who you may not know at all, but the community or the part of the community you're trying to reach knows and trusts that person. And that person also sees the potential of that community. They have to have both of those characteristics, because we have a lot of people that have one or the other. So they're known and trusted, and they see the potential of that community, because we have a history of no trust, right? Because of all of these things that our country has done, our field has done, different communities have done, either purposefully or passively, we have a lot of trust that we have to build, especially for people who've historically been excluded. That might be rural communities that have been excluded for a long time from opportunities that big cities have received. That might be across racial, ethnic, immigrant lines. That might be across income lines. There's a lot of distrust. That's the reality of where we are. And I think one of the things that I try to help people recognize is that it's so much better for us to have the uncomfortable conversation than deny it exists. And that it's a real opportunity for us to reach out to these connectors and say, how do we build trust? We have this opportunity to help. What is your advice, right? How do you want me to work with you to reach this part of the community? And that one of the things that we do is really look at how are we engaging people from across our demographic diversity, whatever the diversity is in the community. that we're engaging small business owners across that diversity so that we make sure that whatever actions we take reflect their needs.
Yeah, I definitely notice as planners, we often do downtown plans or small area plans, and it's a lot of data gathering and looking at the statistics and then using those. And we have a couple of public meetings and then project ideas and get feedback. But this one really focuses heavily on talking to individuals and learning from the community. And you spend a lot more of your time on talking with, one-on-one or very small groups versus doing the data and then going out to different individuals. Moving on to some of the barriers that are discussed in the groups, you talk about high rents in downtowns or absentee building owners, and especially in smaller communities that I've worked in, I've seen this a lot where owners out in California, they're non-responsive and you've got this vacant storefront that would be great to fill up, but you just can't. What are some of the strategies or tools that you can recommend to help overcome some of these barriers to start filling these spaces?
So this is really one of those things where I feel like my blood boils every time I end up in another small town or a small city where we have property owners like this. We know that on a federal level, the tax law means that if you have vacant property and you leave it vacant, you can take it as a loss. So and I need to write a ranting article about this at some point. And it means that you're more or less allowing people to create the equivalent of the town dump in the middle of a town's Main Street. And most communities do not have any way to deter this. The thing I advocate for the most is a vacant property ordinance, which some cities have, but it's still a small number. And what it's saying is the negative impact of your neglect costs everybody else money. So you're going to cover that cost. And the fee has to be so high and punitive that it deters the property owner from keeping hold on that property or leaving it vacant. The added challenge on top of that, though, is the reality that some of these vacant properties are, in fact, local owners at this point. I just did a whole bunch of work in very small towns in Indiana, and they have the town square. They have properties right around the square, a town of 2,000 people, and the market is upside down for the commercial properties. And because they've left the property vacant already for 10 years or 20 years, the cost of rehab versus what they can get on a lease for their ground floor space is upside down. And so we also need to create policies that are, in many cases, funded incentives or matching funds or low-cost loans from revolving loan funds to help start to flip the economy. Cost of construction is really high. We can't deny the real economic factors of what's going on in communities, but we can also deter people from doing it more.
And then another barrier that you kind of touched on in the answer from another question was about zoning. And so I'm curious, as a lot of us planners work with zoning codes often, what kind of strategies would you suggest that we look at when we're trying to support small scale manufacturing from a definition standpoint? Do we just define artesian manufacturing, or do we list specifically what kind of small scale manufacturing?
Well, the answer is it depends, right? We're planners. So I think the baseline is having an artisan manufacturing land use definition. Copy Nashville's if you want a nice simple one. If you want a really complex one, you can copy Fairfax County, Virginia. The Nashville one more or less says hand tools or small machines. I don't remember if Nashville or if some places do a limit on the square footage of the space, which can go both ways. But I generally think of it as long as it's not making any noise or fumes greater than anything else that is already allowed in that space, why wouldn't you allow it? So there's fire and health and safety considerations, right? So there might be a cost issue of making sure that the space is safe enough, just like if you would have a restaurant move into a storefront. So the cost might become a barrier, which is a different question. But from a zoning and land use perspective, I think the first step is to make sure there is no barrier to entry from a policy perspective. I do want to note, though, that changing the zoning is only a piece of the battle, because when we did this with Fairfax County, Virginia, the definition is much more detailed than I wasn't involved in Nashville, than what Nashville did. But the next thing we did was ask the question is, okay, how do we get it through permitting? Because they'd never had this as an allowable use. So we got everybody around a table, quite literally, who had anything to do with getting an occupancy permit for a business. And I created scenarios of a real building with real businesses that I changed the name to protect the innocent of moving into that space to say, okay, how would you permit this? And there were more questions than answers at the beginning, which is totally fine. But we have a responsibility as planners and as government leaders to iron out all of those questions before a business gets there. We don't want the business to be the one that has to figure it out. So I think it's important to think about both steps, that it's not just the policy change for the zoning, allowing artisan manufacturing. I encourage you to include food production and beverage production in that, because breweries are probably one of the best downtown anchors we have right now, especially if they have outdoor seating. But also thinking about the entire rest of the process for these businesses to get into the space. So both pieces.
I'm curious in your work if you've seen, or which kind of department is usually responsible for leading these kind of processes and creating the new way of doing things. Is it planners that are typically trying to get everyone together and have these conversations, or the economic development people, or?
It comes from, the leadership on this comes from everywhere. I mean, we've worked with the mayor making it happen, the head of the economic development office, director of planning. We've done this where it's coming from the head of Main Street or the Downtown Development Authority, an improvement district. When we did work in Columbia, Missouri, the leadership on this came from a community improvement district that's a corridor north of downtown. So they became the advocates not only for investing in these kinds of spaces, but the policy change that was needed. So the leadership can come from anywhere. I think it's much more about being clear about what the vision is, what are you trying to achieve, and why is that important? And I think in many cases as planners, we focus on the technical side. We were talking before about, data and data collection. And somebody very wise a long time ago taught me that these decisions are 20% technical and 80% emotional. And I think that when I first learned that, it was really a gut punch for me, because I was an analyst. I did maps and I did numbers, and I was so happy in my spreadsheets. And I know you understand. And he was right. And that led me to start learning about, how do we talk about this work? How do we describe this work? How do we do it in a way that's not wonky, that's not technical? That even by talking about zoning or mixed use downtown or complete streets, which I love, we are excluding people from the conversation. And so, I always talk about a place, how I experience it. One of my favorite questions to ask people when I'm working with them in their community is, tell me what you want it to be like on a Saturday at 3:00. How do you experience walking down the street in this place on a Saturday at 3 or Tuesday at 6? And if they say, depending on how technical the person is, if they say something like, I'd like to see a mix of uses on this block, I'm like, no, try again. I'd like to see stores with their doors open and people walking in and out. That's how we need to describe the work we do. So I think that there's a lot of ways to think about how we get there.
This next question kind of gets into the weeds a little bit, but a lot of studies have shown that existing buildings are the most affordable for some of these smaller businesses, newer businesses, but that's not always an option, or you might need to infill with new construction, but that can raise rents beyond what these smaller businesses can afford. And you talked about prefab as being an option for these small businesses, but a lot of times we're trying to preserve kind of this historic character and a certain feel in the districts that make them more pleasant. How do you kind of mix the two and preserve the affordability in new structures, but also keep the feel of a place?
It's a really good set of questions. I think we have to think about the reality of where we are today and who we're trying to serve today. So I think about development these days almost in reverse. Who do we want to use the space, and what can they afford? And then based on that, what do we build? And how does that fit into our vision of how the place comes together? As opposed to what I totally advocated for a really long time was mixed use. Put mixed use downtown, put ground floor, activate the ground floor everywhere, right? Which meant that we literally spread the retail peanut butter everywhere without thinking about who was going to be in that space. I said things like jobs, housing, balance, right? I mean, that was sort of the magic wand. That was the answer for a long time. And the reality is that we have to think very specifically about where are the intersections where we want the mixed use, where do we want housing, and how does a person experience that space? But on top of that, who can afford that space? And we talk about this from a housing perspective, right? When we talk about affordable housing or attainable housing, we're really thinking about how do we make sure that people from the community can afford a community. But we don't have that same conversation about commercial space. And so how we design a building and how we build what materials we're using and who's doing the work all impact who can afford the space. And the reality is sometimes when we look at larger developments, they can discount the cost of their ground floor space because they're going to make it up on a different part of the project. But they have to think about that in their pro forma from the very beginning to say, some of the big developers will say, well, we want the ground floor to really be the brand of this place. So we know that we're going to charge less for that ground floor because we're going to make it up in the apartments upstairs, or we're going to make it up in the office building next door, or whatever it is. So you're making trade-offs where you're going to end up actually with a higher revenue because of this brand that you're creating with the place. On the other hand, when we look at incremental developers, local people like yourselves who do individual buildings at a time, there's not enough square footage to make a trade-off. So then we have to also look at if the market is upside down, if the cost of construction is really high, how are we supporting the rehab of these buildings? And what does it look like? You brought up prefab. I also think about short-term uses. Activating spaces is something we've always talked about, or for a long time we've talked about in planning. But in fact, when we look at some of the really big developers in some of the bigger cities that get, 28, 38 acres, what do? They do a tiny bit of construction. They create something that's a draw, a little bit there, and then they program it out a ton. They do a ton of branding and programming and events because that creates the brand of the place. It creates the identity, actually creates the property value in that location, and then they go vertical. And so we can do the same thing in our downtowns, our main streets, and our neighborhood centers if we want, but we have to think about what does not only short-term activation look like, but why are we doing it? To what purpose? And I think we're at a really interesting stage in the planning field to really be able to knit those pieces together with our partners within the community to say, we want this in the short term to create this in the long term. And really get people to think through that process the same way I look at holiday markets, or a lot of communities do a summer concert series outside. One of the questions I always ask is, well, how many small product businesses do you have as vendors in your community doing that? Those are your entrepreneurs. Those are your future storefront users, at least some of them. And so if you can help them have this cadence of being at a market, being able to sell things, testing out product market fit, testing out their branding, and then on top of that, potentially give them training that helps them figure out their revenue to get to a storefront, you're building your own small business community. And so really thinking about the spaces, right? Short-term, long-term, different size, different prices, but thinking about it from startups to scale-ups and the assistance that businesses need to get there.
And then we always wrap the podcast up with the last question being, what do you think is the most important thing that listeners or readers of your book should take away from the book?
That's a hard question too. Most important thing to take away. I think the most important thing to take away is that you can do it. That everything in that book to me is a known piece. And that being able to bring downtowns back to life and to be able to create strong local economies takes a lot of work. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it is simple, and that every community can take it on. And I hope that the one thing people take away from the book is that your community can do it too. That's also why we have worksheets online that anybody can download and start running with it. My hope is that people take it and start asking the right questions, or start asking different questions within the community. When I was speaking to a couple of community organizations, they were talking about the city running a visioning strategy for a historically Black neighborhood north of downtown. And they said that the city had hired a community engagement firm to do the outreach for the vision. And I said, well, what are they doing? And they said, well, they hosted a few public meetings. And I said, so did the same people show up that always show up to public meetings? And they said, yes. The city is going to get the same answer that they probably started with because they're getting the same people at those meetings. And that in this day and age, and this was true 15 years ago too, but just so true today, that there's no excuse anymore for us to just do the generic public meeting because it's not the public. I have extensive conversations with folks about equal access versus equitable access. I think we've convinced ourselves that a public meeting is equal access when it's not, because in fact we have historically excluded populations so they don't trust the process. We are doing it in a date and time that doesn't actually mean equal access for different people. And when we started doing more of these things on Zoom during the pandemic, a ton of people with disabilities or with conflicts at home all of a sudden could participate in public meetings. I spoke at two public meetings during the pandemic where, as much as I'm very involved in this, I don't actually do this very much at home. And I think we have to think about what is our responsibility to go out and meet people where they are. And that is a lot of what is in the book, is going out and finding the people who we need to have their voice. We need to have them at the table. And it means, quite literally, from my perspective, that we're bringing the table to them. We're not asking them to come to us, we're bringing the table to them. And I do think we're at a really exciting turning point around what that means and how we get there.
You made a good point that when I read the book, it wasn't anything like any crazy new concepts or anything that I didn't know, but pieced all together. I think it pushes us a little bit more to think more thoughtfully about what we're doing and to try and make more connections within our communities so that we have those broader frameworks, or we know that connector person to then open us up to a whole new audience versus, again, just the public meetings, or lately it's we'll go to them and go to their activities and just be there. But I think it's taking it even a step farther and making those one-on-one connections that are so important. There's a proliferation of food and beverage businesses in commercial areas that create vibrant spaces. So what are your feelings on these uses versus small-scale manufacturing? Also, what are your impressions of Omaha so far?
My not quite 24 hours on the ground. We're almost at 24 hours. So food and beverage. That was the question. The attraction of food and beverage is a draw to a place. I have nothing against it. I think it's great. I love having wonderful places to eat where I live or where I visit. It's not going to work everywhere, right? It works in a city like Omaha because you're big enough and you use it as part of your tourism. There are a lot of communities where the income within that community is not high enough to have disposable income for a lot of restaurants or beverage places, or the population is just too small to support that many places. Every community, no matter what size, wants a tap room downtown. I mean, 1,000 people to whatever size city. Everybody wants that downtown. So there's a role for food and beverage. And the model doesn't always work for that business to have some kind of distribution, right? So when we look at breweries, there's a huge, people in the industry have explained to me that there's this huge bifurcation that's going on in the brewery world, that you're either going really small and really local and not canning, or you're going really big and that everything in the middle is starting to die out because of the nature of the costs. And so, just like everything else, I feel like we have to go into it with eyes wide open of saying, okay, what's realistic here now, and be aspirational about it. My perspective is the more that we think of small scale manufacturing as a yes and, it's not an instead of, it's a yes and. It's a business sector that nobody has ever, up until recently, nobody really ever thought about having downtown. Nobody thought about putting in storefronts. Nobody thought about being an attraction and an added benefit to the downtown. So I think of it much more as a yes and they're particularly strong in places that don't have the foot traffic now and can be complementary uses to food and beverage as part of it. Omaha's been really great. I'll give you the wonderful tour that we did yesterday afternoon, driving around town. I have to tell you, I read about this neighborhood 5-6 years ago, so I'm really excited to get to be here. And we walked all around this neighborhood, Commons, but then being able to drive around different parts of the city, see the old market, South Omaha, North Omaha, and really seeing sort of the different neighborhood centers that are in different parts of the city has been phenomenal. You also have more parking garages than I think I've seen in a city in a long time. You also have one-way streets all over your downtown, which you will never have retail downtown until you fix that. So there's things to work on, but you have a lot of great bones in downtown, and you have a lot of great momentum in specific places. I think it's figuring out how to get there. I went to the Farnham Hill co-work space yesterday to do some of my work, and so walked from this part of town over to there. So I walk cities. That's how I get to know my sense of direction and get to know what I'm doing. I walked up the hill to Capitol Hill and saw your beautiful Central High School, which is unbelievable. I always come back to the same question, right? Everybody deserves to live in a place that feels valued. And this is a lot of the beginning of the book for me. And what does it mean to enable more people to be a part of that? And what do we need to do in the physical space for that? What do we need to do from an economic development investment perspective to do that? And what do we have to do that from a communication standpoint? And all of those pieces are involved in the solution. I think you guys have really good spots. And so the question is, how do you spread that impact?
Have you ever run into issues with commercial businesses or building owners that are already in downtown being worried about these new small scale or artisan manufacturing uses driving down values or activity, maybe because they're unfamiliar with what those uses are?
So we definitely need to talk to property owners, right? People need to understand what we're talking about. And I don't know if you've noticed, but anytime I've used a term today like small scale manufacturing, I've defined it as I go. And when I talk to folks, I use pictures a lot. And this is true of all of our work as planners. I think we have to show people what we mean and not just use whatever the term is. So, I'll talk about product businesses. I'll talk about artisans. I'll talk about the vendors at our holiday market. I think sometimes the greatest challenge is, in fact, that the property owners think that these businesses are high risk because they are not a national chain. And so there are different barriers we have to get over in terms of that. But I think as long as we're defining it and showing people what we mean and using examples from the community as part of that, then people get there pretty quickly. When I started Recast City, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to describe this business sector, more time than anybody wants to spend trying to figure out a term. And I landed on small scale manufacturing because maker businesses is in many cases not how anybody thinks of their business. Right. And a lot of people thought it was a fad or it was elitist or it was just on the coast. So that one went away really fast. Small industrial was even worse. Right. I ended on small scale manufacturing because it's way too many letters and it's way too many words, but it lets us really hone in on that people are making things. And you have to be okay with that at some point. You can say, no sound and no fumes greater than the local restaurant or the outdoor bar, right? I mean, like whatever it is, but I think you have to show people the examples of who this is in your community. And that's actually where we start a lot of our work, is helping people find these businesses in the community so they understand at a very local basis who we're talking about and what the potential is.
In a place where you have planners interested in putting these pieces together, but the existing power structure isn't ready to move in that direction, what's your recommendation for planners to help steer the ship in that direction, even if the leadership doesn't see the need to change because things are running okay, but may not necessarily be improving and could actually be signaling potential decline?
It's a great question about how do we steer the ship as planners when it's okay enough. I don't know if anybody else thinks about planning this way, but I think about it as the psychology of places. And we work in places that the bottom of the economy dropped out decades ago, 20 to 60 years ago. And the people who lived through it don't believe that it's ever coming back. They won't necessarily tell you that, but that's in their heart what they believe. The pie is small, it will never grow again, and I will fight to keep my piece of the pie. Siloed, lots of turf warfare, right? We've all seen places like this. And I go to places like this and I more or less say, only talk to the young people because they didn't go through the trauma of the market bottoming out. I literally went into one city at the end of our project there and I said, stop talking to everybody over the age of 35. Now that included me at the time, but it was just remarkable how traumatized people were by the economy completely bottoming out in that community. So that's the places that are in desperate need, but somebody believes, right? So those are just specific challenges in those communities. Then we have a whole bunch of places that are okay enough. There's not really any growth going on. There's not really much loss going on. The incomes are good enough or even fine, but there's no real there, or there's no excitement there. And as planners, that's the beginning of the end to me. Like it's gonna go down, or it's going to stay at that level, but everybody else is going to succeed if they figure it out. And then there are the places that are creative and helping. I think that in the places that are okay enough, it's really hard. I'm with you on that. My answer always is find the people who might get excited. It might be one or two property owners. It might be one organization. It is showing the success of a specific thing is how we get other people bought into it. So I always look at what are the short-term wins that we can make very public. So that might be more holiday or concert series or pop-up markets for local producers in a specific place. That might be working with a specific property owner to create a commercial shared kitchen or a space like this, right? Showing people what's possible. And the goal might not be to turn the entire economic development strategy on its head in the community, because there are a lot of communities where the person who runs economic development is going to be old school and go big game hunting, and that's just what they're going to do. And there's nothing I can do about that right now. But if we can start getting some investment in the sector in terms of training and space and loan structure, we can start creating the momentum for this sector. So I always look at who's willing to play, right? And really using a lot of the strategies in the book to sort of dig through people and figure out who's excited about the idea, because it's digging through parts of our community in a way that we've never done before, and really trying to figure out how do we strengthen that part of it, even if the rest of the system isn't necessarily going to be full in behind them. That's a great question.
How specifically do these principles apply to small towns, say with populations around 1,000 people, that are struggling to stay afloat?
I think the answer in a small town almost always is going to start with home-based businesses. And this is true in a lot of communities, not just really small towns. Because of the pandemic, we had this combination of people who had storefronts, who left them and took their businesses back home, and people who had started businesses for one reason or another during the pandemic that they now want to figure out how to grow. And then we also had people who were always making things before and still maybe even more so want to pursue that as what they're doing. And so when we go to really small towns, we find that once you ask the question, who's making things and selling them part-time on top of their day job, or who might be part of a holiday market if we set up a holiday market, it is amazing to see the dots that people start to connect. Oh, I know somebody, I think she's selling her pies, or, this other woman is doing woodworking and selling tree ornaments, or this guy is making, I don't know, whatever it is. And the stories are just unbelievable. So one of the communities that we worked with in Indiana, one of the things that they did was they found a whole bunch of these home-based businesses, and they invited them to be part of a holiday market where they'd always had a parade, and they had, their tree lighting, but they never had vendors. They never had that piece of it. And they said it was nothing like they'd ever seen this year, because people were so not only overjoyed to be a part of something in the community and get it come out, but to be able to buy things from people within their community and support them. People were so proud of being able to do that. And then once we identify them, a lot of those people, from my experience in smaller towns, a lot of them are not online. They're doing it only locally. Maybe they never thought about e-commerce. Maybe it's considered, they think it's too big of a hurdle. But being able to train people about how to have either be on a shared site like Etsy or have their own e-commerce site. There are a lot of different platforms that people can use now to sell products that they make. But there's a whole bunch of branding and online promotion and social media that any community can do to also echo what you have there, not only to draw people to town, but draw people to websites. So I always look at what are those really small steps, the really small incremental steps that a community can take that start building this infrastructure. And it might be something like, well, let's find 20 of these home-based businesses and let's invite them for coffee, right? Because we also know from a business perspective that business owners who have strong social connections to other business owners are twice as likely to succeed in their business. So, and we know all this from the tech sector. There's so many things that we learned from the tech sector over the last 20 years that we just need to sort of adopt and customize for what we need to do. So really getting to know each other and support each other, and then finding mentors or training for them. And with that goal in mind of, we want you to be our some of you to be our storefront someday. They might be in it on their own. They might share space, right? There's tons of different ways of getting there. And thinking about what are one or two property owners that might be open to that? Is there anything that the town owns that could be a part of that? And thinking through from A to Z all of those steps to get people where they need to go. There's 3 factors that are always going to make a difference. It's the technical assistance, it's the real estate space, appropriate for startups and scale-ups, and it's the capital for the real estate and the small business. And so always looking across those three factors.
Thank you so much to Ilana for joining us at the workshop and for participating in Book Down Planning's first live recording of an episode. If you enjoyed this episode or our podcast, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. If you have a moment, we would love it if you could leave a quick review of the show, which helps us reach more people.